price floor is pretty similar to a price ceiling, except operating in reverse. Okay? So let's set up our supply and demand framework for a perfect competition model to start. And a price floor is going to tell us that the price cannot fall below a certain level. And I'll denote that with a P with a lower bar here. So in the absence of any intervention, this is where we end up. And if we set our price floor down here, it's non-binding again, because we can't go below that, and we're not. However, if we set our price floor above the equilibrium price, then we're at a price, then we get an effect. We're now in a situation where the price floor is binding. And when a price floor is binding, we have the opposite of a shortage, we have a surplus. The quantity demanded is here, and the quantity supplied is here. Okay? So that turns out to cause problems as well. For there to be a surplus in equilibrium, we do require that the firms really can sell their product to somewhere and get that price. So, for example, it may need to require that the government is a buyer of last resort, because if you can't force consumers to buy this product if they don't want it, then somebody else has to, okay? Because you can see that at this price, at this elevated price, they basically don't want the good, and the supply is not there. So two things can happen, basically. It could be the case that the suppliers have somebody who will buy from them, in which case there's this surplus and they sell it off to the government. So one example would be the government used to guarantee certain prices for agricultural commodities like milk, and if the market didn't want all the milk that the farmers were producing, the government would buy it instead, okay? And it would create like a reserve, or it would make it into cheese and use that for other programs. Another option is it could be that the government says, you can't charge a price below this, and that's the end of the story. In that case, it could be that even though firms know that, in that case, even though in theory firms would be able to get this price, they know that if their quantity supplied exceeds the demand, that they're not going to be able to sell their product. An example of this is sort of the minimum wage. Okay, so if labor markets are perfectly competitive, and we'll argue in the next video that's debatable. If they are, then basically that means we could imagine a supply curve of being how much people are willing to sell their labor for. And a minimum wage says you're not allowed to sell your labor for a price below this. But firms, in this case, firms' demand for labor is the demand curve. And if there's no government jobs guarantee program that says if you can't find a job for the minimum wage, we'll take you on, then basically that leads to unemployment, a surplus of extra labor. Okay. All right. So just as the price ceiling leads to a decline in welfare, we're going to find the same thing for a price floor. Okay, so if there had been, in the presence of a price floor, consumer surplus is here, and producer surplus could take on one of two roles. If there's like a government that's going to buy this stuff, then all that stuff gets sold, and producer surplus is this big region here. Okay. However, if that stuff gets sold, what are they going to do with it? Are they going to give it back to consumers and force them to take it, basically use tax revenues to buy it? In that case, if they're giving it back to the consumers through their taxes are paying a higher price for the good than they want to pay, and the value they receive is negative. Okay, that's the consumer surplus they receive from getting it back is negative. Okay, you can imagine the government, buying milk using tax dollars and then sending it back out to people, or even just throwing it away. Whatever the case, the outcome is bad. And you can see here that the total, in this example, the total welfare is going to be, we're going to get positive from consumers here. We're going to get positive for producers in this green region, but here where red and green overlap, those two things cancel out, and we end up with sort of a net zero in that area. But over here in this red triangle, we still have waste, basically. We have transactions that people want to cancel because the cost exceeds their value. Okay? So again, we're going to lower welfare. It's also possible that we might not have like a government program that's going to guarantee that it's going to buy all this stuff. And that's easy to model too. That looks just like that looks pretty similar, I guess, to the last one. Here we have this consumer surplus, and then the producer surplus is this region here. It doesn't extend all the way over because they're not able to sell, for example, their labor. And instead, we have deadweight loss in that case over here. Because these are transactions where if I could charge a price below the price floor, I'd be able to find someone to make a deal, but I'm unable to do that. Okay, so the main takeaway is that in the presence of perfect competition, you can't increase welfare with a price floor. You benefit, just like with a price ceiling, you can benefit some people. So in this example, the firms receive a higher price, and either they all receive a higher price, so it's great for them, or some of them are able to sell and some aren't, so the ones who are able to sell get a higher price and they benefit. It's worse for consumers, and on the whole, it's kind of worse for everybody. But just like with a price ceiling, in other types of models, the reverse is true. So I'm not going to go into the same level of detail because it's the same kind of general argument, but just like a price floor is like the opposite of a price ceiling, there is a thing called a monopsony model instead of a monopoly model. A monopoly model is when there's a single seller of a product and they keep the price too high. A monopsony model is when there's a single buyer of a good or service, and so they're going to charge an unusually or an inefficiently low price. And in the presence of a monopoly, they charge a price that's too high, so a price ceiling can bring it back down to where it should be under sort of a perfect competition level and raise welfare. Under a monopsony model, the price is artificially low, and so if we create a higher price floor, we can bring it back up to where we would want. So an example in the real world is like if a firm is the only firm in town that can hire people, there's no other jobs around, it may choose to offer its workers a wage that is artificially depressed because they've got nowhere else to go, and it hires fewer workers. Okay. In that case, a minimum wage would not lower employment, okay, because just like a price ceiling increases the output, a price floor will increase the output sold for this monopsony case. It's basically everything is kind of the mirror of each other. And in fact, a lot of studies find that minimum wages, like increasing the minimum wage, does not seem to lead to large unemployment levels. Okay, it depends. You know, it's not always the case, but lots of the evidence, at least as of the time that I'm recording these, finds that the effect of raising the minimum wage is pretty minimal on unemployment. It doesn't seem to create a surplus, and that could be because firms have monopsony power, and there's other reasons it could be that case too. Another example, which is related, is if there's externalities. Again, you can use a price floor to reduce the quantity or raise the quantity, depending on if you're going to have a buyer of last resort in there. And in the presence of externalities, there could be too much of a good or too little of a good. And so having a tool to move that around could improve welfare. All right, let's move on to the next policy tool that governments can use to intervene in markets.